Okay, so the evolution of federalism, which is lesson 9, is going to round out this first unit of study on the theoretical foundations of our Constitution, and so we're going to look at federalism and the way that it has been operated over the years of our nation, and we're going to examine how it has morphed over time. All right. So, how flexible is federalism? Very. It's extremely flexible, and it allows for a lot of change in the problems that face the nation, and the relationships between the states and the national government over time. Um, we see the state and the national relationships change significantly throughout the history of our nation. And so federalism has had to adapt, and it has taken the shape of form of different types over this period of our nation's history. We have seen federalism in a way known as dual federalism. We've seen a cooperative federalism, and we've seen what's known as creative federalism, or this federalism that is sometimes called a new federalism. So let's get a brief understanding of these different types of federalism that we've seen throughout our nation's history. Dual federalism really characterized the relationship between the state and the national governments between the 19th and the 20th centuries. And dual federalism is going to involve specific areas of influence between the two different branches. And at the national level, the national government's powers are going to be obviously designated by the Constitution, right? We've seen those enumerated in the Constitution when we looked at the anatomy of the Constitution. But state governments, their powers during this period of dual federalism was really to provide for the most basic services and needs of citizens, right? And so under this system, there was little financial assistance given to the states from the national government. Each level, state and national, exercises their own powers in different areas, and so there wasn't really, a whole lot of give and take between them regarding funding or anything of that nature. They each had their own jobs to do, and so they sort of carried out these jobs dually in tandem with one another or concurrently, right? And so under this system, the states are more dominant. They're less reliant upon the national government for money and things like that. And so they're able to provide for their citizens personally. And so they're much less, or they're much more dominant. They have a lot more power in that regard. This is going to begin to decline some after the Civil War, and we're going to start to see, as we move into the 20th century, we're going to start to see it taper off even more, especially as we come around Depression time. And so what this is going to lead to is what is known as cooperative federalism. Excuse me. And cooperative federalism is really going to take effect in the 1930s, and it's going to be significant even into the 1960s. And under this type of federalism, the national government is going to supply more money to the states. So whereas we see under the dual federalism, there's not a whole lot of money coming from the national government to state governments. That's going to change under cooperative federalism. And some of the things that are occurring during the 1930s are going to precipitate this, right? We've got that national depression that is occurring, and in order to sort of try to pull us out of that, the federal government is going to start spending immensely, and so it's going to start supplying a lot more money to the different states. The cooperative nature between the levels of government is to provide for the assistance of citizens. And so the state and national government are going to cooperate to ensure that the citizens are taken care of. And so as I was just saying, this is really going to begin in the National Depression when the government got more involved with the citizens' well-being. And so we're going to start to see significant levels of cooperation between the state and the national government, with the national government sort of funding most of these new programs and these new ideas so that the general welfare of the citizens can be taken care of. And so in the 1960s, this is sort of going to taper off and taper into what is known as creative federalism. And then we see creative federalism occur between the 1960s and the 1980s. And the lines of control or spheres of influence between the state and the national governments during creative federalism is going to be increasingly blurred. And this type of federalism allows for national governments to decide what the states need, right? And so if we look at the beginnings of creative federalism under President Johnson, we're going to start to see significant investments in education and in poverty, and we're going to start to see very, very large expenditures from the government. And so the federal government decides that there's going to be a war on poverty, and that we need to make gains in education. And even though a lot of these things can be dictated by the states, the national government is going to start spending in these areas, and it's going to trickle down to the states. And then as we move under President Nixon, new federalism is sort of going to emerge, where the national government gives the states more control in program administration. And so it's a lessening of the federal government sort of implementing programs on the states, and it sort of allows states to sort of pick up the slack and administer these programs sort of as they see fit. And then as we get into Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, who was very adamant about lessening the role of government in society, Reagan is going to begin pulling back on the amount of money that is given to the states, right? But even though he's going to lessen the amount of money that is given to the states, the money that the states do get, they get more control over how to spend it. So this is going to be seen as a return of power and responsibility to the states. And so, Reagan was not a big believer in a very strong national government. And so he's going to return some power to the states and allowing them to spend the money that the national government gives them, more as they see fit. Less money, but you get to spend it the way you want to spend it, right? With less federal strings attached. So as we say, it's seen as a return in responsibility of power to the state. So there's going to be this ebb and flow between, the national government and the state government, who takes power and who gives power. And, it really just depends on what faces our nation during that time in history. And so federalism is extremely flexible in that it can sort of ride this ebb and flow back and forth. So what about the relationship between the states? So we've been talking about this relationship between the national government and the state government. What about the relationship between the state governments, right? Article 4, Section 1 is what is known as the Full Faith and Credit Clause. And it states it says that states are required to recognize judgments, judicial proceedings, and public records of other states. So, it seems obvious that, if something occurred in another state, if there was a judgment in another state, that another state would recognize those, right? But it's not as obvious as it may seem. There have been some historical examples of this not being the case, where one state will not recognize a judgment or a legislation or a public record of another state. And so let's look at some of those. One thing that, might not seem very paramount is this idea of divorce, right? And there were very strict laws in different states that governed how a person, or if a person, could get a divorce. And So we start to see some states not recognizing divorces from other states. And this is going to create a problem if you are divorced in one state and you go to another state to get married, right? And this is going to be during the 1950s, and divorce is not something that is as big of an issue, in modern day. It's widely accepted, but in the 1950s it was sort of taboo. And so, if we look at Nevada, people would go to Nevada to receive a divorce because Nevada would grant them, and then they would come back to their home states, but their home states wouldn't recognize divorces, right? And so we have this full faith and credit clause, but it's not playing out the way that it's supposed to. So what occurs is the national government's going to have to get involved in the judicial system. And so the judiciary is going to hand down a series of rulings. The Supreme Court is going to hand down a series of rulings, and the full faith and credit clause had to be enforced regarding this topic. All right. So we're married in one state. We run to Nevada to get a divorce. When we come back, our state has laws that say we can't be divorced, so it doesn't recognize the divorce that we got. And so we have a situation where one state is not recognizing the judgments or the occurrences of other states, and the judiciary has to get involved and has to hand down some rulings to remedy this. Another area is the child custody or child support laws, and the federal court's going to have to end up forcing all states to recognize and enforce child custody and child support rulings, regardless of what state they're made in. The Full Faith and Credit for Child Support Order Act, or the FFCCSOA, states that requires that states enforce child support orders made by other states, and this is going to become effective in 1994. So, if you were in one state and you were required to pay child support, if you moved to another state, that didn't require you to pay child support, then you might have a loophole. And so it's going to be creating some domestic issues, within the family. And so the federal courts step in and say, hey, if there's a child support judgment in one state, it has to be enforced in whatever state that person goes to. And then, of course, gay marriage, which is probably one of the most modern rulings that you may be most familiar with. Excuse me. But in 1996, there was an act signed into law called the Defense Against Marriage Act, which, essentially banned gay marriage, right? But over the course of the next 20 years, individual states began legalizing gay marriage while others outlawed it. We've already looked at the fact that Texas outlawed gay marriage in 2005, but there's other states like California that were allowing gay marriage to occur. And so if you happen to move from California to Texas and you were in a gay marriage, Texas wouldn't recognize it. And so this is going to become problematic. And it sort of created a system where we didn't know which state was right. And so we're going to see a Supreme Court decision handed down in 2015, right? Obergefell versus Hodges. It rendered state laws outlawing gay marriage unconstitutional. And so when a Supreme Court decision is handed down and it outlaws or it renders a state law unconstitutional, essentially it becomes legal in any state. And so any state that had passed a ban on gay marriage essentially had to overturn their laws and start issuing marriage certificates to gay couples. And so these are just some ideas, some ways that you can see federalism illustrated throughout history. You can see the flexibility of federalism as our nation progresses and So this is going to conclude our first unit of study. We're going to be moving into our first assessment quiz and then our first unit assessment. All right. So make sure that you're caught up on all your reading assignments. Make sure that you've looked at least the PowerPoints slides for this unit and listen to my lectures if they're helpful, and get ourselves prepared for this first quiz and this first assessment that you're going to see at week's end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know.